Foreign policy is dominating the conversation in Washington this week as President Trump continues to monitor deadly protests in Iran.
Well, President Trump has said executions have been put on halt for now. He has also threatened to intervene if tensions continue. Iran, on their end, says they're open to negotiations, but are also not backing down from possible conflict.
UNC Chapel Hill political science professor Dr. Naven Bopit joining us this morning. Naven, thank you so much. I want to start here. So this really all started coming to a head about 2 weeks ago when the economy in Iran is basically in a free fall. So how did we get here?
So Iran's economy has had significant problems for some time. I mean, one of the things just sort of that really emphasizes this, if you look at their exchange rates, I looked this morning and I think it's $1 for every 42,000 Iranian rial. And then you can add that they have water shortages. They've been under very significant sanctions for a long time, so it's hard for them to sell their oil on the open market, and that's predominantly what their industry is. And then we can add there's likely some significant mismanagement within Iran itself. So all of these factors are very significant and seem to be coming to a head at this particular moment. But some of these have been underlying for some time.
Okay, so where we are today, Naven, is, we're hearing that thousands of protesters have been killed. The president is also hearing that maybe those killings have stopped for now, but we also don't really know what we're hearing. The internet's been blocked for a lot of the Iranians that live over there, so we don't know what information's correct, what is not. What are we doing as of today? I feel like there's this almost match of chicken going on between we're going to say we're going to do this, who's going to flex their muscles on both sides?
Well, I think it is unpredictable. So given Iran's situation, I think you would have to expect that the regime would go out of their way to signal that they are in control. And that the protesters are an illicit movement. Oftentimes in these situations, what you see is that the government will start to blame the foreign protesters on external elements. So they might say that this is a foreign plot, that the United States is supporting these types of things. And so they will try to signal that they are in control. And one of the ways you can know that they're in control is if any of their military elements stay with them and don't defect to the protesters. The defection is a key sign that the regime is falling apart. From the U.S. perspectives, it seems like that what the Trump administration wants to do is to keep open the option of military force and perhaps also influence Iran in other negotiations. So to do that, that's a reason to threaten military force. If the U.S. were not to threaten military force, then Iran would probably not regard or care what the United States is saying. But the fact that that is on the table is something that will likely get Iran to listen and perhaps give the United States some concessions if a bargaining process opens.
Naven, to your point, we have heard that Iran has said this is the doing of Israel and United States. And in terms of a regime change, looking at it, how close are we? Because this is probably the deadliest we've seen in Iran in probably a decade. Are we on the verge of a possible regime change there?
So right now, I don't think so. Again, we have to see how this plays out. Again, it's a dynamic situation, so I don't think we know anything for certain at this particular point. But again, one of the key things to sort of pay attention to is there an organized opposition? Has the military defected? The some of the key Iranian Revolutionary Guard councils, those are the ones that are significantly loyal to the Ayatollah and the regime, and they have not defected. In fact, they're the least likely to defect. So I think where you have to look at the police and military, if they start going towards the protesters, if they stop following orders from the regime, then that's a sign that the regime's in real trouble. But we just haven't seen that yet.
All right. Excuse me, Naven. So we talk about the U.S. talking about these protesters, saying that this violence shouldn't be happening, the country should not be killing these people who are protesting. But can the U.S. really protect those protesters from so far away?
I don't think so. I think in fact, if we look at the Trump administration statements before yesterday, in a sense, the Trump administration was in a way encouraging the protesters and saying that help is on the way. And so what that help means is a little bit unclear. So what the United States could possibly do to protect the protesters, maybe they could initiate things like no-fly zones that would require some fighting, perhaps with the Iranian Air Force. Perhaps they can start to show that the United States has a presence in the region, but it already does. So what exactly, since in a concrete way, how they protect the protesters, that's unclear other than a direct intervention. And if a direct intervention were to happen, that likely would embolden several of Iran's defenders. Add to it that it's unclear if the protesters are perfectly aligned with what the United States wants in Iran. Their protests are over corruption, over mismanagement, over a breaking of the regime's promise to govern Iran better since 1979, and over economic issues. So how the United States addresses all of those, I think, is very unclear.
Navin, yesterday there was a new Quinnipiac University national poll that came out, and it said 70% of Americans don't want the U.S. involved in Iran at all. Let them handle this on their own. Why is this relationship in this part of the world important for us? Why should we care?
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, Iran, prior to the revolution in 1979, Iran was the U.S.'s biggest partner in the Middle East, right? Since the Shah of Iran was someone that the United States really was concerned about protecting. Once 1979 happened and we had the revolution, that in a large way was a protest against the Shah and his tie to the United States. And the reason why the United States was so deeply invested in Iran had to do with oil. But also, if you take a look at a map of Iran, you'll see that they border a key waterway called the Strait of Hormuz. And from that waterway is where the bulk of the world's energy originates and gets to the global market, because oil is sold on a global market, which means that any disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz disrupt everybody's oil supply and affect the price of oil everywhere. So for that reason, and because oil is still a valuable commodity, and because it then factors into the price of food, of medicine, of lots of other things that societies use, it is a critical point. And because Iran is adjacent to it, and Iran has periodically threatened to close it, and it's looked at as sort of important that way. That's a big reason why the United States cares. Add to it that historically, since 1979, Iran has made it a point to try to attack several U.S. allies in the Gulf area, and it has rivalries with them, has tried to do that through proxy. That's a reason why the United States is deeply concerned about Iran and very, very wary of Iran's government.
Navin, we want to continue this and talk about what we could see next out of Iran and what we might do as the United States. So we're going to ask you to stick around. We'll be right back with more from Dr. Navin Boppat after the break. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with UNC Chapel Hill political science professor Dr. Navin Boppat about the situation in Iran. Navin, as we look to the future, what could come next? And as you mentioned earlier, who could come to Iran's aid if the U.S. decides to get more involved?
Yes. So if we look at Iran's allies, their alignments are typically with, or at least in terms of security, are typically with Russia and China. And neither of those are in a position right now to really assist Iran. Russia has its own problems in Ukraine, which is a grinding war that costs a lot. It has kind of signaled already that it's not terribly interested in supporting Iran. At least it did during the short war between Israel and the United States earlier with the bombing campaign. And China, I don't think, has the military assets to really put into the theater here to really try to stop any sort of external intervention. So I think Iran is really on its own. And so that's probably part of the reason why Iran has been willing to try to talk with the Trump administration, just because I think they realize just how vulnerable they are.
Well, Dr. Boppat, what do you see as the immediate next steps here in the coming days?
There's a possibility that things start to wind down. Again, I don't see a strong opposition leader emerging. We haven't seen significant defections from Iran. So again, we have to wait and see. But right now, it looks like the regime might make it through this. But if it does, the memories of this will still last. Their economic problems are still there. They still have a ton of issues that they have to deal with. So the regime is really vulnerable. Add to it that they've lost a lot of their regional presence as a result of Hezbollah's weakening, as a result of the fall of Bashar Assad in Syria. So I think this regime is in real trouble. And I think because of that, they're probably going to try to negotiate with the United States. It's not clear what more they have to give, though, because a lot of their nuclear assets were destroyed, they're believed to be destroyed in the bombing campaign that happened earlier. So I think that this regime is actually in significant trouble, and it remains to be seen how they try to get themselves out of it.
And it remains to be seen how long this could take. I'm sure this is not the end of this conversation. Dr. Navin Boppat, Professor of War and Peace at UNC Chapel Hill, thanks for your insight. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back right after this.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.